The rain had stopped just as I turned the key in the heavy oak door. The hinges groaned, the same sound I remembered from summers spent here as a boy, and the scent of dust and weathered pine rolled out to greet me. My grandfather's ranch, 150 years old, stood exactly as it always had, stubborn, proud, and unyielding against time. This place wasn't just a house. It was a living testament to every calloused hand that had repaired its beams, every generation that had stubbornly refused to sell. When my grandfather passed, the deed came to me, no mortgage, no strings, just a patch of land and the kind of silence you can't buy in the city. I'd been here less than 24 hours when the knock came. Not a polite, neighborly knock. This was the rapid, insistent pounding of people who arrive with a decision already made. I opened the door to find 3 strangers standing in a precise row, all wearing matching navy jackets embroidered with a gold crest. Oak Ridge Homeowners Association. The woman in front spoke first. "You must be Mr. Carson," she said, in a tone that made my name sound like an inconvenience. "I'm Gretchen Ford, president of the HOA. This is Robert, our compliance officer, and Linda, our treasurer." I blinked at them. I didn't realize this property was in an HOA. "It wasn't," Gretchen replied briskly, "until the Oak Ridge community expanded. Your parcel falls within our jurisdiction now. We've reviewed your home and, unfortunately, there are multiple violations of our neighborhood aesthetic guidelines." I almost laughed. The ranch predated Oak Ridge by more than a century. Their aesthetic was beige vinyl siding and decorative mailboxes. My place was all hand-hewn beams, rough stone, and a roof weathered to silver. "Violations?" I asked, keeping my voice even. Robert stepped forward, reading from a clipboard. "Unapproved fencing, non-compliant exterior color, non-conforming outbuildings, the list is quite extensive. You'll need to submit architectural change requests for all these issues, or face daily fines until the property is brought into compliance." Linda added, "We'll also need to discuss your barn. Structures of that size require HOA approval, and from what I can tell, it wouldn't meet code." The barn they were talking about was older than their entire subdivision. I stepped onto the porch, closing the door behind me. "With all due respect, this house has stood here for 150 years. My grandfather lived here his whole life. You can't just—" Gretchen cut me off. "We can. And we will. Our community's value depends on uniformity. We'll give you 30 days to make the necessary changes, or we'll pursue legal remedies." Her eyes lingered on me in a way that felt less like enforcement and more like a challenge. I wanted to tell them to leave, but part of me was stunned. I'd never dealt with an HOA before. I didn't know the rules, didn't even know if they could do what they were threatening. And that uncertainty, that's exactly what they were counting on. They handed me a thick packet of papers, violation notices, rule books, fee schedules, and left without so much as a handshake. The silence that followed was heavier than before. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee gone cold, reading through their so-called guidelines. Buried in legal jargon, the message was clear. People like me, with properties that didn't fit their manufactured image, weren't welcome. It wasn't just about paint colors or fencing. This was about control. I remembered my grandfather's voice, gruff but steady. "You don't let someone push you off land your family's kept this long. If they try, you push back harder." The next morning, I walked the property line. The barn stood solid against the horizon, its red paint faded to a soft brick color. The house's cedar siding glowed warm in the rising sun. Every board, every nail, told a story that no HOA could erase with a fine. Still, I knew I couldn't fight something I didn't understand. So I started small. I spoke to the nearest neighbor, an older man named Tom, who'd lived here since before Oak Ridge was even a blueprint. He shook his head when I mentioned Gretchen. "She's been running that HOA like her own little kingdom for years," he said. "People try to fight her, but she always wins. Folks get tired or scared. Some sell. She buys up the land cheap, flips it to developers. Wouldn't surprise me if she's got her eye on your place." The idea hit me like a cold wind. That was it. They didn't want me to change the ranch. They wanted me gone. By the time I walked back to the porch, my mind was set. If Gretchen Ford thought she could bully me into handing over the only piece of my family's history left, she had picked the wrong fight. And she was about to find out just how wrong. For the next week, I kept my head down and my ears open. Every morning, I'd find another neatly folded notice wedged between my front door and the frame, each stamped with the Oak Ridge HOA crest. Failure to remove non-compliant shutters. Unauthorized livestock shelter. Unapproved flagpole. They weren't subtle. The message was clear. We can bury you in paper until you either comply or quit. But I wasn't going anywhere. Instead, I started treating each notice like a trail of breadcrumbs. Each one told me something about how the HOA operated, how often they inspected, how quickly they issued fines, and just how far they were willing to stretch their rules. My first real lead came from Tom. We met again on his porch one evening, the smell of fresh-cut grass in the air. "You're not the first they've tried this with," he said, sipping iced tea. "Back in 19, a guy down on Willow Creek had a shed they didn't like. They fined him so hard he sold the place. Guess who bought it?" "Let me guess," I said. "Gretchen," he confirmed. "Flipped it for triple." That wasn't enforcement. That was a business model. The more I listened, the more I saw the pattern. Gretchen's HOA targeted homeowners who couldn't afford prolonged fights, retirees, single parents, anyone without the time or money for legal battles. And once they sold, Gretchen or one of her allies bought the property, renovated it into Oak Ridge blandness, and pocketed the difference. The turning point came at the county records office. I spent an afternoon there, hunched over brittle files and scrolling through public sale logs. The connections weren't hard to trace. Gretchen's name, her husband's company, and a handful of shell LLCs, all linked to former HOA targets. That's when I found the silver bullet, the HOA charter. It spelled out election rules in tedious detail, meeting schedules, ballot requirements, term limits. I read every word twice. There it was, buried in the fine print. The presidency was up for vote every 2 years, and the next election was in just 6 weeks. 6 weeks. It wasn't enough time to tear the HOA down from the outside. But maybe, just maybe, I could take it from the inside. That night, I spread my findings across the kitchen table like a general planning a siege. Names of sympathetic neighbors. Voting eligibility lists. Meeting schedules. I wasn't naive. Gretchen wouldn't go down without a fight. But if I could show the rest of Oak Ridge what she'd been doing, maybe they'd stand with me. The first ally I found was Sarah Collins, a quiet woman who lived 2 streets over. She had a small art studio in her garage, until the HOA forced her to remove her sign and repaint the door approved beige. She'd been keeping her head down ever since, but when I told her about the election, something in her eyes changed. "They never told me I could vote," she said. "They don't want you to know," I replied. One by one, I sought out the discontented. The man fined for planting vegetables in his front yard. The retired couple who'd been ordered to cut down the maple tree they'd planted 40 years ago. By the end of the second week, I had 12 people ready to back me. Gretchen must have sensed the shift in the air, because the attacks escalated. A citation for improperly stored garden tools after she peeked over my fence. A fine for unauthorized exterior lighting, referring to the single porch bulb my grandfather had installed decades ago. Then came the letter. It arrived in a crisp white envelope with my name typed in sharp black ink. Notice of intent to initiate foreclosure proceedings. I read it twice before laughing. It was an intimidation tactic. Fines can't lead to foreclosure unless they're astronomical, and mine weren't even close. But she didn't care about legality. She cared about fear. Fear makes people fold. But I wasn't afraid. If anything, it confirmed I was getting under her skin. By the end of the month, my list had grown to 28 voting members. Enough to give me a fighting chance. We agreed to keep it quiet, not to give Gretchen any reason to suspect just how many were on my side. On the last night before the election announcement, I stood in the barn, the smell of hay and oil in the air, and thought about my grandfather again. He'd fought droughts, market crashes, and storms that tore roofs clean off, but he'd never lost the ranch. I wasn't about to be the one who did. When I walked back to the house, the porch light cast a warm circle on the old wooden steps. Inside, my notes and plans waited. 6 weeks to change everything. And Gretchen Ford had no idea what was coming. The morning of the election announcement, Gretchen's voice rang out over the HOA's online bulletin like a war drum. The upcoming leadership vote will determine the future of Oak Ridge. We must protect our standards from those who would undermine them. She didn't name me, but she didn't have to. From that moment, the pressure tripled. Robert, the compliance officer, began making random inspections every other day, jotting down notes with an almost theatrical frown. Linda sent me a revised fine statement, quadruple the amount from the week before, citing administrative recalculations. They weren't trying to enforce the rules anymore. They were trying to exhaust me. But every move they made only reinforced my message to the neighbors. Gretchen's HOA wasn't about community. It was about control. I doubled my efforts, visiting every eligible voter I could find. We didn't have the luxury of lawn signs or public rallies. Gretchen would have shut those down instantly, so we moved quietly. Conversations over fences, quick chats at the grocery store, whispered agreements at the post office. Some people were hesitant. Fear clung to them like smoke. What if she finds out, they asked. I told them the truth. If she stayed in power, she would find a reason to come after them eventually. No one was safe in a kingdom built on intimidation. With 2 weeks to go, Gretchen shifted tactics. She called a community safety meeting in the clubhouse, promising refreshments and a presentation. I went, of course, and walked straight into her ambush. She'd filled the room with glossy pamphlets showing photos of neglected properties. Every single one was my ranch, shot from angles that made it look like a condemned relic. She spoke about preserving property values and removing obstacles to growth. The implication was obvious. I was the obstacle. When she opened the floor for questions, I stood. This ranch has stood for a century and a half without your HOA's help. Tell me, Gretchen, how exactly has it lowered property values? A murmur rippled through the crowd. Gretchen's smile didn't falter, but her eyes sharpened. History is important, Mr. Carson, but progress is too. We can't cling to the past at the expense of our future. Our future, I replied, shouldn't be built on bullying our neighbors out of their homes. Silence fell. Then, somewhere in the back, someone clapped. Gretchen adjourned the meeting early. From that night on, she stopped hiding her hostility. My mailbox was vandalized. My trash cans were mysteriously misplaced every collection day. Once, I came home to find the barn's side door hanging open, nothing taken, but everything slightly out of place, as if someone wanted me to know they'd been inside. It worked, but not in the way she intended. The more she pushed, the more my supporters solidified. Fear turned into anger, and anger turned into resolve. Finally, election night arrived. The HOA clubhouse smelled faintly of coffee and tension. Ballots were counted in front of a small crowd, each slip of paper folded and dropped into the wooden box like a heartbeat. Gretchen sat at the head table, flanked by Robert and Linda, all three dressed as if attending a corporate board meeting. I stood near the back, hands in my pockets, meeting the eyes of my neighbors one by one. When the last ballot was read aloud, the room was dead quiet. 29 votes for Carson, the secretary said, her voice wavering. 28 for Ford. For a moment, Gretchen didn't move. Then her chair scraped against the floor as she stood, her smile brittle enough to crack. Congratulations, Mr. Carson, she said, the words tasting like ash. I hope you enjoy the paperwork. She didn't wait for the applause. She walked out, heels clicking against the tile, Robert and Linda trailing behind her like shadows. The gavel was placed in my hand. It felt heavier than I expected. This wasn't just about my ranch anymore. I'd been handed the keys to the very machine that had nearly crushed me. Looking around at the faces in the room, some relieved, some skeptical, all curious, I realized I had exactly one chance to prove this victory meant something. The old rules had been written to protect power, not people. That was about to change. The first morning as HOA president, I unlocked the small office at the clubhouse and found it exactly as Gretchen had left it, sterile, overly neat, and smelling faintly of lavender cleaner. The filing cabinets were locked, but I had the keys now. What I found inside confirmed everything I'd suspected. Stack after stack of violation notices, many for petty or fabricated offenses, were neatly paired with payment receipts. The amounts were outrageous. Buried deeper, I discovered ledgers that didn't match the official budgets. Large withdrawals labeled as maintenance corresponded with no actual repairs. Several checks were written directly to companies owned by Gretchen's husband. It wasn't just unethical, it was criminal. I documented everything. Photos, scanned copies, itemized lists. Then I called an emergency meeting of the board and invited every HOA member in the neighborhood. Gretchen didn't attend, but I made sure her absence was noted in the minutes. When the meeting began, I stood at the front of the room with the projector humming behind me. The first slide showed a violation notice for unauthorized exterior paint color, issued to a widow down the street, followed by the fine amount and proof that Gretchen had bought her house 2 months later for half its market value. The room was dead silent. Slide by slide, I laid out the pattern. The inflated fines. The sham inspections. The property flips through her husband's company. Every number, every date, every document was right there, projected for all to see. By the time I finished, the silence had turned into murmurs. Some people looked shocked. Others looked angry. "I'm proposing 3 motions tonight," I said. First, that Gretchen Ford be permanently barred from holding any position within this HOA. Second, that we refer all financial irregularities to the county for investigation. And third, I paused, letting the moment breathe, that we amend our charter to protect historic properties like the Oak Ridge Ranch from arbitrary aesthetic enforcement. The motions passed unanimously. The following week, I hand-delivered the evidence to the county clerk's office. 2 months later, Gretchen was facing formal charges for embezzlement and fraud. I didn't celebrate when I heard. I didn't need to. The ranch still stood, untouched, and so did the neighbors she had once bullied into silence. That was victory enough. As president, my first act was to dismantle the punitive system Gretchen had built. Fines were capped, inspections required photographic evidence, and all meetings were open door. For the first time in years, people actually attended, not out of fear but because they wanted to. One evening, Tom stopped by with a bottle of rye. We sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the pasture. "You know," he said, "I didn't think you'd pull it off." I smiled. Neither did Gretchen. He chuckled, shaking his head. She picked the wrong man to mess with. I didn't argue. The truth was, I hadn't set out to lead anything. All I wanted was to keep the ranch. But somewhere along the way, defending it had become about more than one piece of land. It had become about the people who'd been too tired, too intimidated, or too alone to fight back. One by one, those people started stopping me on the street, at the market, in their driveways. They thanked me, not just for taking down Gretchen, but for giving them their voice back. I never told them the truth, that their voices had been there all along. They just needed a reason to use them. Months later, the ranch looked exactly as it had the day I moved in. The cedar siding still caught the morning light. The barn still stood like a sentinel at the edge of the pasture. And every time I walked the property line, I thought of my grandfather's words. "You don't let someone push you off land your family's kept this long." The difference now was that no one in Oak Ridge was going to be pushed off theirs, either. On the day the county posted the notice about Gretchen's upcoming trial, I tacked a copy to the bulletin board in the clubhouse. I didn't add a caption, didn't make a speech. The paper spoke for itself. By evening, someone had written across the bottom in black marker, "We run this place now." For the first time in a long time, I believed it. And as the sun set behind the hills, bathing the ranch in gold, I knew one thing for certain. I hadn't just saved my home. I'd made sure no one would ever have to fight this battle alone again.